hit the record and we'll make a start with today's session. Welcome from ICPS and Government Exchange. We're brought here today to talk about a new perspective on professional development, looking at how the industry has changed post-COVID-19. This is a real opportunity to look forward on how we can develop our teams involved in serving the public. We are delighted to have two keynote speakers for you today. Bhartendra Singh Baswan is an experienced civil servant, has had a long career in senior governmental positions, including Director of the Indian Institute of Public Administration, Director of Indian Secretariat Training and Management. And we're also joined by John Mark Williams, who is the CEO of the ILM, or the Institute of Leadership and Management. John has inspired great leadership throughout his career and recognizes that post-COVID-19 leadership development will be essential in rebuilding collaborative, agile, socially conscious and future-ready organizations. So we're delighted to have both of these keynote speakers join us. In addition, we've also got our Executive Director, Tracy Capaldi-Druitt, who will be delivering 3 presentations throughout this 2-hour session. The first will outline ICPS's training offer for individuals looking for professional development. The second will be focused on training solutions for organizations looking for training specifically tailored for a group of learners. And finally, supported by Jerome Goodluck, who is also from the Institute of Leadership and Management. Jerome, nice to see you. The third presentation will be how we can support learning in the workplace with e-learning and online coaching. And finally, to enable all of us to keep the discussion going, ICPS are launching a new professional development network. Everyone attending today will be eligible to join. Following this session, we will be sharing, as well as all the PowerPoint presentations from each of the speakers, a recording of today's session as well, and also this chat box, which we're going to find is a great facility for sharing information and comments and questions. We'll also be, with that post-event email, we'll be sending you a link to join this new professional development network, which, as I say, will be aiming to keep this conversation going in the months and years going forward. Just a quick note on the ground rules. We're expecting around about 200 people in the room. I think we've got about 126 at the moment. We might have a few more people joining in the next few minutes. So unfortunately, we're not able to allow everyone to unmute themselves and get involved in that way. But we do hope you will get involved through the chat box. I can see a number of you already introducing yourselves, so thank you very much for that. Please feel free to share your email addresses with everyone if you so wish. But also, as the presentations are going along, if you have any questions, comments, thoughts, that you want to share with the group, or that you want to be put to each of the speakers, please put those questions and comments into the chat box, and then I can pick from them following each of the presentations. Also, though, I can see a lot of you have already turned on your videos, so thank you very much. I think it's wonderful for each of the speakers to be presenting to a room full of smiling faces. So that's lovely to see. But really, with that, what I will now do is I'll introduce the first of our 3 ICPS presentations. So Tracy Capaldi-Druitt is, of course, our Executive Director. So Tracy, the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Jack. So if I want to share screen, okay. So hopefully we are getting that. So hopefully everybody can see my screen.
No, that was the emails, so I'll just stop that quickly and then.
Okay, beg your pardon. Let's see if we can get that again. Bear with me one moment. Hopefully we now have, oh.
No, that was still the email. So this is all part of the fun of Zoom, is just figuring out which buttons to press.
Do you have that now?
No, not yet.
Let's try one more time.
Perfect.
Okay, so thank you very much, everybody. Yeah, thank you for the Jack for the introduction. Welcome to everybody, all of our speakers today, and most importantly, everyone who's come to watch us. So thank you for that. So first of all, my first presentation is going to be about our open public course portfolio. And this is primarily for individuals who are looking for training. Now, the contacts on the screen here, my colleagues Ginevra and Navid are here to help out in relation to any further detail that you may want following this presentation. As Jack said, we'll be sharing this, so their contact details are there, and the slides will be circulated. Again, but also please put questions in chat, and we'll try and deal with those as we go. So first of all, tell you a little bit about ourselves. And what I don't intend on doing is reading through every bullet point on the screen here. But there were three real key points that I wanted to point out to bring to everyone's attention. First of all, we've been delivering for many years training courses for people within public service around the globe. And we had historically been doing this on an open course basis, on courses running every day of the week in central locations in London. Clearly, since pandemic, we've not been doing that, but we have been doing exactly the same, but running those virtually. The second thing that I wanted to kind of to flag to you is that our approach is very consultative, and you'll find the team very friendly and helpful in terms of identifying exactly the right courses for individuals that are looking to develop their professional development within public service. And thirdly, is that we update our material very regularly, not just from a regulatory perspective, but also looking at contemporary approaches to learning effectiveness. So those are the key points, but as I say, there are more. Okay, so when we develop our courses, we strive to create pathways, and we like to cater for a raft of different of levels, so senior and junior staff, experienced and lesser experienced. And you'll find within our portfolio a range of sort of introductory, intermediate, and most recently mastery level courses. And additionally, our courses come with the benefit of certification and professional membership. So in terms of the professional membership, and again, I won't read through all the points on this slide, but leave it there for you to review. But what I think is really central for us is being able to bring the extra value of certification and membership by a globally recognized professional body as a quality mark. And we feel very much that our relationship and partnership with the Institute of Leadership and Management does just that. So what courses do we offer? Well, hundreds. And they range through 1 day through to 4-day courses, all delivered virtually. And they sit within these kind of broad areas that you see on screen. As I said, is that my colleagues Ginevra and Navid can provide you with the detail of all the courses within those general areas at a later date. However, I just wanted to highlight a few courses that are scheduled at present, just to give you an idea. Now, on the left-hand side, you'll see a range of courses, and these tend to be our 3 to 4 day courses. And then on the right-hand side, you will see our 1-day courses. So this is just a snapshot of the schedule at present. and of course, all delivered virtually. We use Zoom as we are today, and we also use Microsoft Teams as well with our delivery. But the point that I wanted to really bring out here is that our virtual delivery is with live trainers, okay? Some virtual delivery tends to be pre-recorded materials that learners can go through, and that has its value, but we feel that there's a much more strength in terms of being able to deliver the training live with the expert to give you that ability for interaction. And we spend a lot of time focusing on how we be able to utilize the features and functionalities that are available with the Zoom and Teams platforms, and how we can really replicate that great experience that one would achieve in the classroom. Okay. Trainers make the difference. We absolutely believe that in terms of our professional development courses. I know this is a bit of a busy slide, and again, I won't go through all of it, but I wanted to flag that the key points here. Our trainers are top level trainers. They are very experienced in delivering training. They've been delivering training for many years, many environments, to many organizations at many levels. But also, as well as being expert trainers, they are practitioners. So ostensibly, they have operational experience in delivering what they teach. And I think that's really key in terms of making sure there is a realism and there is a synergy in terms of the audience that they're working with. Okay. And additionally, what we do where appropriate is we add guest speakers to our events, just to give that further relevance in relation to the topic area. Measurement in any investment in training is essential. Now we use, in terms of our evaluation, something which professional learning and development professionals in the room will certainly know, but we use the Kirkpatrick model when constructing our post-course evaluation. Now we use the post-course evaluation reactionnaire, that's level 1, as a fairly standard process. But what we also do, which I think is quite unique, is that we also look at a level 2 evaluation for our training courses. And basically, we after a 6-month period, we'll go back out to our learners with an evaluation and try and understand what they may have gained in terms of knowledge, and more relevant, what they've applied in work practice in the workplace. So what do learners say in relation to the ICPS courses? Well, statistically, from our survey data, you can see that we are regularly scoring highly in terms of meeting learning objectives, the effectiveness of our trainers, the quality of our course content, and the value that we bring. But what I also wanted to do was just to highlight a few anecdotal comments here, which we've just pulled from recently. And I think what's important here is kind of brings to life the fact that we're receiving plaudits in relation to the virtual delivery itself, which is a comparatively new format of delivery in relation to training delivery. And also is to look at the depth that we are providing in terms of our training, and also the levels in terms of we're approaching. And so there's some very senior delivery that we've had here. So that's the end of the first presentation. So what we've looked at there, we've looked at what we can provide for individuals who are looking at professional development in public service. The next presentation, short again, is aimed at organizations who may have a group of learners and are looking for something more customized in their approach. Okay. So for many years, we've been designing and developing and delivering customized courses for organizations, and we've been doing that face-to-face. What we've been doing would be flying trainers around the globe, designing courses, adding content, removing content, working closely with our customers to contextualize case studies to ensure that we are meeting the needs of that particular group of learners in their environment, in their geography. But now we're doing it virtually. Okay. Our areas of expertise are, again, these aspects of public service, Parliament and government, governance and anti-corruption, electoral affairs. I won't read them all through, but you can see, and again, at levels that suit the audience, whether introductory, intermediate, or mastery level. Now, our approach to custom design and delivery, again, this circle, no stranger to learning and development professionals. But what I'd like to highlight there is that the key of the learner and customer engagement. We spend a lot of time focusing on making sure that we get the organizational and also the individual's learning objectives recognized in the programs we develop. The design process is very iterative. So we work very closely with you, going back and forth until we get it absolutely right, so that we ensure that the delivery and what we provide and deliver for you meets your needs exactly. And delivery, it can be phased and timed. One of the big benefits in terms of virtual delivery, that makes that a lot easier. But that's something which we do a lot of when we're delivering larger programs of several events for organizations. So the final piece in relation to this second presentation is that I'd like to try and sort of bring to life a little bit what I've tried to present in terms of our provision of service to organizations looking for a customized solution for a group of learners. Okay. And so we've got a couple of case studies, and I will read through these ones because I think they're a little bit more key to do that. Okay, so the first one here was a developmental program. Now, both of these customers here were looking for a development path for their senior teams with the business goal of improving their policy making across the organizations. Now, we've been delivering for several years 5-day courses to their senior cohorts, and subsequently to help them with a developmental path for that senior team, we designed a series of 3 2-day in-depth masterclasses looking at further specific areas of policy making. Okay. Now, all of those courses now have been delivered both face-to-face and virtually, and those individuals have been moving forwards on their development path in terms of good policy making within their organizations. Now, the second case study I wanted to talk about was where we'd given direct operational impact by the work that we'd undertaken. Now, this was looking at an initiative around trade and investment. And we were asked to develop a 2-phase program where we'd be delivering one event specifically for their management team, looking practically on focusing on trade and development techniques. And then a separate event, which was looking more strategically at the whole economic status, was with their ministerial group. Okay. Now, this program was designed specifically to support the newly formed department strategic plan. And it had the added benefit, actually, of the senior management team's cohort of receiving membership of the Institute of Leadership and Management. So that's our first 2 presentations. So the first presentation, say, was in relation to what we can provide for learners who are looking for professional development for themselves as individuals. The second presentation was around what we can provide to organizations who are looking for a group of learners who may want to be having a customized development or a program of development. And the third, just to give a little bit of a segue to it when we get to that, and I will just check with Jack in terms of timing, will be about supporting learners in the workplace. Okay. So thank you, Jack.
Thank you very much, Tracy, for that brilliant presentation. Really great insight, not only to the kind of services that ICPS are offering, but also you know, an interesting insight into the kind of training solutions that organizations in this space have available to them. I know there will be some questions for you, and I think we've got some time towards the end of this session, probably after your the third presentation, to come back to that. I think what we'll now do is move across to the first of our two keynote presentations, which is provided by Batendra Singh Baswan. Batendra has had a long career in senior governmental positions, including Director of the Indian Institute of Public Administration, Director of Indian Secretariat Training and Management. Batendra is also passionate about reform and the evolution of professional development. So we're delighted to have Batendra with us today to deliver this first keynote presentation. Batendra, hopefully you can hear me now. If so, the floor is now yours.
Thanks, Jack. Thanks, Tracy. And sorry for the delay. I had a slight problem logging in. I have about 20 minutes or so, 25 minutes. I'll try and make it a little briefer than that, because I do know that giving a lecture is far easier than listening to one. So I'd just like to flag a few broad issues about public policy and my work area. I clarified that I'm a practitioner rather than a trainer, because what happens is that in training institutions, they tend to look askance at those who aren't practitioners. So I've been basically a practitioner in governance issues and a trainer probably after that. Now, coming to the subject at hand, as far as public policy is concerned, many of you are familiar with the subject. And it's not a preferred discipline in any case, at least in our country. But public policy is largely about interest groups. And I just flagged 3 or 4 public policy drivers. The first, I believe, is ideology. An ideology provides an intellectual framework. It gives you a clear vision, but sometimes it can, and sometimes does, become a substitute for thinking. Because if you believe in an ideology almost completely, then you probably follow a system of a willing suspension of disbelief. And therefore, what happens is that you tend to look a little uncritically at the prevailing ideology. Now, ideology has governed our country as well for a number of years. And we inherited this from the British, in fact, because every thinking person in the 1930s had to be left of center. And this was necessary because, to take you back to your economics 101, when consumption and investment dry up, the government has to come in. And World War II was the ultimate Keynesian input, as it were, which has not been adequately acknowledged. It was FDR's New Deal in the US and the Keynesian interventions in Britain and other European countries didn't fully end the recession. World War II did. Now, the belief was that state intervention is not only necessary, but desirable. Growing up in post-war Britain, coming straight from India, where there was no shortage of anything, I got 1 bottle of yogurt a week and 1 egg a week. So when I complained to my landlord, he said, "Son, Mr. Churchill is coming back. You'll get your egg and you'll get your yogurt." So Mr. Churchill came back. I got my egg, I got my yogurt, and I gave up socialism as a belief, as an ideology. Now, what we are seeing today is the ultimate end of ideology, in a sense that we realize today that ideological instruments can help you up to a point, but you need to fine-tune your economies, as we have done post the global financial crisis, where you can use Keynesian inputs, monetarist inputs, even some Marxian inputs. So what we might see is the growing irrelevance of ideology. The second driver, as I see it, is rent seeking. Rent seeking can not just outright corruption, but in order to ensure that you get re-elected at any cost. And for this, we find democratic leaders perhaps working against the interests of the country, and therefore what's probably good economically may not be very good politically. At least this is the belief. The third is, of course, populism, what the Americans call public policy, what they call pork barrel politics, and what we in our country call vote bank politics. So populism extracts a certain price. Now, given this backdrop, examples are many, and I wouldn't like to give you too many of them, given the time available. But if we take, for example, let's take the US intervention in Iraq. This is before Gulf War II. Now, what happened was that Saddam Hussein was not the nicest of people, and his son Uday probably even less so, but he was secular and he didn't have weapons of mass destruction. What happened was that the US went in, and the driving force behind them was probably not a desire to, get rid of the weapons of mass destruction, because Saddam Hussein, for all his faults, was secular, and he wouldn't have allowed Al-Qaeda to take root over there. But then we had the arms lobby, the construction lobby, the supply lobby, and the oil lobby. So very often lobbies tend to capture government, what we call policy capture, to use a more contemporary term, state capture. So interest groups are always there. You can't wish them away. The Americans have made a fine art of this because they bring lobbying into the open space, as it were, where lobbyists are recognized as a factor. The lobbying is very much there, maybe a little more transparent than in other countries. Now, as far as governance is concerned, we obviously, many of us in India believe that democracy is the best answer, and yet it has its flaws. And public policy is also influenced by what the public believe in. And very often, democracy can lead to the rule by the lowest common denominator. But looking at a couple of examples in India, we had the problem about gays, because gay sex was outlawed in India. It was a Victorian rule, which combined with Indian middle-class morality led to the prosecution of those in the gay movement. Not many were actually convicted, but it was there on the statute. So the judiciary took it up, and the Delhi High Court gave a notice to the government of India, asking them for their views on the subject. The Home Ministry and the Health Ministry were required to respond. When the Home Ministry people had their meeting, they said, what do we do? So the Home Secretary said, the answer is do nothing at all. Because if we support the gays, then the religious right, Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, Parsis, everyone would have ganged up against us. So therefore, we can't really support them. And if we oppose them, then the human rights people, the international community, and gay rights would also be angry. So the Home Ministry said they threw the hot potato into the Supreme Court's, into the High Court's lap, and said that we'd like to be guided by the Honorable Court. The Health Ministry were also squirming. They said, on the one hand, we don't have nothing against them, but on the other hand, this could lead to an increase in AIDS. So the Chief Justice of the court lost his temper. He said, can't you people speak with one voice? And the newspapers, to the lasting credit, carried the headlines, government swings both ways on gay sex. And my point is, governments always swing both ways. On whatever issue there is, they like to be different things to different people. And this is one of the strengths and the weaknesses of democracy. And yet, as a system, we certainly believe it's workable. A lot of countries today, democratic countries, are regressing, tending to become a little more authoritarian. The current suspects are, of course, the heads of government in Turkey, in Hungary, in India as well, in Brazil. So what happens, the issue is centralization of power a kind of default? Is it something that people revert to a form of natural regression? This is something which scholars, I think, are taking a look at. Coming to the other part of the topic, which is professionalism in the civil service, we, like many, in fact, we lag behind other professionals. Good doctors tend to stay abreast of developments in their field. Academics, not all of them, but many of them, in order to survive, as it were, try and stay contemporary and understand what exactly is happening in their field. So this kind of professionalism does not always exist in civil services. They're given a grounding, and having done that, in a country like Britain for years, they learn by literally by sitting by Nelly, as it were, and learning a bit on the job. But as far as civil service training is concerned, a person learns much more by, by actually working, making his or her own mistakes, because it's only a very wise person who can learn from the mistakes of others. We learn much faster when we make our own mistakes. Now, there are various worrying developments, governance issues globally. As far as, in fact, I was discussing this with Jack, that the present century has three major game-changing events. The first in chronological order was 9/11. The second was a global financial crisis. And the third is obviously COVID-19. Now, I'll just be flagging some of these issues, and I'd like to perhaps increase the time for questions, that when we look at COVID-19, most countries have made mistakes because everyone, to be fair, everyone is on a learning curve, whether they're scientists, whether they're medical practitioners, whether they're governments. We're not sure exactly how this came about and what is the best way of dealing with it, although there is a broad consensus about what to deal with it. Now, in our country, our system was overwhelmed in the second wave. And this brings us to a larger question as to why our health infrastructure was weak. In most developed countries, apart from the defense budget, government funds go into welfare, into education, and into health. These are the big ticket items as far as a state budget is concerned. Now, in a developing country like ours, we have a Maslowian hierarchy of needs. The Indian voter wants electricity, drinking water, a roof over his head or her head, irrigation, roads, electricity. So what happens is that education, health, and welfare, which are low visibility and long gestation investments, get crowded out in the budgetary process. So therefore, our investment in health and education was abysmally poor. As a former permanent secretary in charge of welfare and education, I would lobby with members of parliament, and they would say that we sympathize with you, but we can't support you because these don't get us votes. The situation may have changed after COVID-19, but this is a glaring fault, not just in our country, but even in a country like Indonesia, which was far ahead of us as far as the social sector was concerned. About professional development, I can only say that it's a question of continuous training, and the direct responsibility would probably rest with the heads of the organization themselves, and they do need to be held accountable. Now, I flagged some of these issues. I would like to make this a little more interactive, keeping in mind the time limit. So I'd give the mic back to you, Jack, as the master of ceremonies.
Thank you very much, Bhatendra, for that excellent presentation, a really good insight into the kind of dominant trends in global politics at the moment, the turning points that we perhaps have all witnessed over the last 20 years, and what that means for professional development and how civil servants and training organizations should react to that. I think what we'll now do, we'll move across to our next presentation. Then, Bhatendra, if it's okay with you, what we'll do, we'll take questions for both you and John together.
Sure.
And so what I'll do now is I'll move across to our next keynote presentation, which will be provided by John Mark Williams, who is the CEO of the Institute of Leadership and Management. Just before I give John his proper introduction, as I mentioned earlier, please put the questions into the chat boxes. As I say, John will be delivering the next presentation. Then once we've concluded with that, we'll open up for questions for both Artenja and John. So in the meantime, please do put your questions for both our speakers into this chat box, and then I can pull from that. Without further ado, I'll now introduce John Mark Williams, CEO of the ILM. John has inspired great leadership throughout his career and recognizes that post-COVID-19 leadership development will be essential in rebuilding development. That will also be essential for creating a collaborative, agile and socially conscious and future-ready organization. John has previously held leadership positions with ACCA UK, the global body for professional accountants, Santander UK, Gateway to London, Newcastle University, and UK Trade and Investment. John will be discussing lead, follow, or get out of the way, the public service paradigm shift. And John will be looking at changes and what has changed and what is still changing, and the balance between demand and delivery and public service. So, John, we're delighted to have you with us today, and the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Jack. And I have to say I was a bit alarmed myself at the sort of grand title that I gave to this session, lead, follow, or get out of the way. Many of you will know that this is I attribute that to Ted Turner. I think a number of people have actually used this as a motto, as a slogan, as a guiding light, I think, for their careers. And the reason why I used it I hope will become clear as I chat through the next 20 minutes or so. I thought, thinking about public service and paradigm shifts and things like this, I generally like to start with the definition of things if I possibly can. So of course I turned, as one does, to Google, where everybody else goes for definitions. And I looked at, first of all, at the definition of a public service. And it said public service to the members of a community, which sounds perfectly logical. Then I went to publicworld.com and they said services on behalf of and accountable to the public. And I thought that's quite an interesting, subtle, but yet quite profound difference. And I said, well, what does this mean then for paradigm shift? Well, first of all, what's a paradigm? A paradigm is simply a perspective or a set of ideas. So a paradigm shift is a fundamental change in our set of ideas, in how we see the world. Okay, I think this applies partly, of course, to the pandemic. I think it applies also to public service. In the past, in the olden days, before the pandemic, public service was the contribution of society to its own well-being. Things that individuals could not all provide for themselves were delivered collaboratively by the public sector. And decisions on what to provide were made initially by governments. And Batendra talked just now about some of those core responsibilities of a government, and health and shelter and education sometimes being big ticket items and coming to the fore, and sometimes being pushed back by other things which appeared more urgent to the population. Because these things were for the good of society, they came wrapped around with rules and regulations to enable universal delivery, and also therefore to protect society a little bit from itself. So public service was there to provide fundamental necessities, to allow people as individuals to go ahead and think about how they wanted to fulfill themselves. We think about, as mentioned earlier, Maslow's hierarchy. Public service actually was to look after maybe the bottom half of that pyramid, to allow us to expand and grow ourselves in our own way. And interestingly enough, I had to look, there's Wikipedia has a list of countries by size of public sector, which I thought was very interesting. And it ranged from Cuba at 77% of the working population to India, interestingly, Batendra, at 4% of the working population, which is not a reflection of how small India's public sector is. It's a reflection of the size of the population, of course. Interestingly, the OECD average was 21% of the working population working in the public sector. So it tells us something about the willingness and commitment of organizations, of governments, to actually invest in public service. So what does this mean for demand and delivery? Well, public service demand is effectively limitless. Everybody in the country wants public services, and they want all of them whenever they want them. So delivery, at least allegedly, needs to be efficient and effective. It's of course funded by taxes, and therefore, you know, people don't like taxes very much. So all the more reason why public service needs to be efficient and effective. The demand, though, is actually in, I'll call it normal times, whatever normal times might be, certainly pre-pandemic, demand generally is for reliable, consistent change in our social well-being. We want things to get steadily better without any surprises. And we want those improvements to benefit everybody. So in the past, the role of leadership in public service consisted of two things. First of all, deciding what would bring the greatest good for the greatest number. And secondly, arranging timely delivery in the future of the services required. And that was an ongoing responsibility for governments, and it still is. And it changed only slowly because society changes fairly slowly, actually. So the data and the decision-making by committee could keep up with the changes in society. And the effect of decisions could be timed for minimum disruption. For example, interest rate rises. We wouldn't expect an interest rate rise to make a big difference tomorrow to the price of absolutely everything. Housing policy would be timed to affect or be affected by the data that we were getting on populations and stuff like that. So there was a fairly sedate approach to public service policy in the past. Fast forward to the pandemic, and all of a sudden, all manner of emergency measures are needed, just as it would be in the onset of a war or any other natural calamity. The data and the decision-making by committee, which characterizes public service policymaking, can't keep up with events. Because decisions need to be made, therefore, in two new and different ways. First of all, at the national strategic level, politicians need to make swift decisions which affect everybody. And at the local operational level, public servants actually need to also make swift decisions which affect smaller populations or individuals. Most important, and this is the biggest difference between the pandemic effect, if we like, and what was true of policy before, the swift decisions have immediate effects. Lockdowns are not planned for 6 months away. They're planned for right now. We do them starting tonight or tomorrow or whatever it is. When individuals come to you or your teams as beneficiaries of public services and say, I have no housing, I have no money, my health is collapsing, they can't wait 6 months for a response. They need a response. So the demand, whilst still limitless, now becomes, we want instant protection and instant problem removal. So the role for leadership changes. It means that leaders now need to decide what new and different things bring the greatest good for the greatest number, and how do we arrange immediate delivery of them. So both the nature and the pace of change have altered, and yet we've still got the same leadership at government level. Now, the impact on the leadership is pretty savage. First of all, at national level, pressure for decisions has never been greater, never, ever. And none of our leaders at national level have ever been trained for this. No, because none of us have been trained for this. And then the forces, this forces them, therefore, to be dependent upon scientific and medical advice. They need to look to those people who have the data, which will help them make the swiftest appropriate decisions. So the leaders become followers. Our national government leaders are now followers of scientists and medical professionals. Okay, now, at the same time, because the decisions are not made fast enough at national level, they still need to be made at local level, you know, housing, health, money, whatever it is. So individual public servants are every day forced to make decisions which are vital and which would normally be made higher up the chain, if you like, at the leadership level, but they need to be made because they reflect immediate need in individuals or small populations. And this distributed leadership emerged almost everywhere in the world. Straight away, people who had not ever held leadership positions were making important decisions that affected people's lives for the better in the face of this pandemic. So people who were not previously thought of leaders, people who were followers, if you like, became leaders. So we had leaders who had to become followers, and we had followers who became leaders. What does this mean for the future, and particularly for professional development in the future? Remember what I said about paradigm shift. A paradigm shift is a change in the way we see things, which means the situation remains the same. We just look at it from a different angle. In some ways, the pandemic is the opposite. Everything has changed. Absolutely everything has changed. Yet our systems, and indeed some of our leaders, not only expect it to go back to the same, they're still acting as if it was still, everything was still the same. And certainly our systems are finding it very difficult to cope with the shifts required, even after 18 months of the pandemic. In the minds of some, I really don't like this phrase new normal because it became a cliche. But however, in the minds of some, the new normal will actually become the old normal again once we get this pandemic out of the way, and everything will be fine then. However, as you know, once you squeeze toothpaste out of a tube, you can't squeeze it back in again. At least I've never been able to, and I have tried. Trust me, I have tried. So reality has changed. The way we behave is now different in two enormous ways that I've mentioned. The leaders have become followers because they had no choice. It's not possible to make national level decisions in a vacuum of data or information. So leaders became followers. At the same time, followers became leaders because they had no choice. It's not possible, as it might be at national level, to put off making a decision for 6 months or a year to see what's happening in theory, or to test the policy, because your constituents as a public servant, they want health now, they want housing now, they need money now. So the public saw this, followers becoming leaders and leaders becoming followers. And it actually might be interesting sometime to discuss what this means for demand for public services in the future, because the public have seen who is a natural leader and who is not from a public service perspective. And because you think about demand in the future, demand, I am sure, and I'll posit this as an idea, will now be for a more immediately responsive and more locally decisive public sector, and the policies that allow that to happen. So to finish off, for you as the public services in your countries, and as public servants, services of the public in your countries, I have two questions. The first one is, do you personally, at whatever level you operate, remain willing and able to lead, to be a leader, because that's the position you've been put in by this pandemic? And what does this actually mean for you in your own pathway in professional development? And secondly, because there are still people in the world who think the future will look like the past for public service, do you think those people will need to get out of the way? So I will finish there, if I may, and hand over to Jack to administer the questions for Bhatendra and myself. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, John, for that really stimulating presentation. So as John mentioned, here is the moment for everyone. If you do have any questions, and I'm sure there are plenty of questions for both of our keynote speakers, please put them into the chat box, and I can come to them while we wait for them to perhaps come in. John, I think my first question to you is, you very interestingly talked about the pace of change and also the importance of the decision-making process. And I'm just wondering, for you, what does that mean for the role of professional development training in the public sector space? How has that affected the importance and the role that professional development plays in this sector?
Well, I have to declare an interest in that I run an organization that is itself involved in professional development of leaders. So we have a corollary of role alongside ICPS. I think in a sense, professional development becomes even more important as we go into a world where, as Justin Trudeau, I think, said, the pace of change had never been so fast and it will never be so slow again. There is no doubt two things are necessary, three things, I guess. One is we need to distribute leadership, the idea of leadership being applied where it is necessary in the interaction with the customer or the beneficiary. Secondly, as a result of that, higher level leaders, if I can call them that, need to let go of authority and responsibility. And therefore, the third point, professional development for everybody is a crucial element of competency in the future, because we can no longer rely upon either politicians or senior officials or experts to make all of the rapid decisions for us. We need everybody to be competent enough. And that means the basic principles of professional development. And from the point of view of your own constituency, the people on this call and the other people who are interested in the work that you guys do, it's really, really important to go beyond the basic principles of professional development and to explore some of the things that we've seen this morning, the case studies, the examples, and those things that actually demonstrate what works in professional development in public service.
Thanks, John. I think I can see we've got a few questions that have come in, so I'll just give it another moment to let a few more come in. My next question, I guess, is to Bhutendra. You talked about policy capture, and I just wonder if you can give us a few examples of policy capture. And I also wonder, what is the role of professional development training in the face of policy capture? When civil servants are, they are confronted by that and different interest groups getting involved in the decision-making process, what role does professional development training have against that? So over to you.
Well, one issue which comes to mind is foreign direct investment in multi-brand retail. Now, obviously, we have 2 or 3 large interest groups in our country, and the present government has been described, well, almost like a nation of shopkeepers, in a sense that the trade business and the mom and pop stores, as you call them in Britain, and in the US rather, tend to have a very powerful constituency. So this means that they feel threatened by multi-brand retail, and that too from foreign sources. Now, the fact is that the consumer will get a better product at a cheaper cost, and this facilitates consumer choice. So it makes economic sense to open this up to competition. But because this particular group is powerful politically, it's worked against the country's interest, and so far this has been effectively sabotaged. So this is one example about how an interest group works against perhaps what could be seen as a larger interest of the consumers in a country. About trainers and training. Now, training is not really it's not a reference group in my country as far as civil service training is concerned. In the armed forces, a stint in a training institution is regarded as a feather in someone's cap. In our case, it's not. And I was telling Jack and Tracy about the old jibe, that those who know how to manage, those who can't become trainers, and those who can neither manage nor train become consultants. So what happens is that they don't really constitute a reference group. So that's another thing. But coming back to trainers and how trainers can convey the message, this is not an easy issue, because civil servants tend to be a little impatient with non-practitioners. So therefore, if you give examples, ultimately it has to come back to your own experience or the experience of your colleagues in the field, which has a degree of credibility with the audience, which are by and large serving civil servants. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bhatendra, for that answer. And we've got a few questions. Quite a few of them have come in for John. But Bhatendra, if you want to, please do jump in and share your thoughts on these questions as well. So the first question comes from Margaret Humphrey, who is from the Presidential Amnesty Program based in Nigeria. Margaret asked, do you not think that the leaders become followers because of the life-threatening tension that surround the COVID-19 phase? So
yes,
John, maybe I'll come.
Yeah, absolutely, Jack. Thank you. And actually, if I may, I'll answer Margaret's question and Victoria's, who's the next question, because Victoria's asking for further clarification on how leaders have become followers as a result of COVID. And I think you're absolutely right, Margaret. The threat, the instant and immediate threat that surrounded the COVID-19 phase forced leaders to accept, actually, we don't know what to do. We need somebody to give us advice. And this is where they were forced to become followers of the scientific and medical community who were giving them advice. And I have to say, I compliment all of those politicians and government leaders who were willing to accept that actually they didn't know exactly what to do and needed to have that advice. So absolutely, they became followers because of that immediate threat. And I think as I said, I think the compliment I would have to pay to them is their willingness to let go sufficiently to accept advice. Having said that, how shall I put it? And it was the word that Bhatendra used earlier on, actually, the authoritarian response, which was to say, well, yes, great, we've been followers now, we've got some advice, and now we're going to go back to being leaders again and tell you to do this, this, and this, was an interesting combination of behaviors, which didn't, thankfully, get in the way of the leadership that was emerging in a distributed fashion.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, John. I don't know, Bhatendra, if you want to come in on that. And I guess I'd be interested to get your thoughts on, you kind of highlighted three, still a phrase from John, paradigm shifts, 9/11, the financial crash of 2008 or 2007, and then, of course, COVID-19. And would you say the COVID, I think John is kind of suggesting that perhaps COVID-19 has had a more significant shift in terms of the pace of change and the significance of leadership. I wonder if Bhatendra, you agree with that, if COVID-19 has had quite a different effect to the other paradigm shifts you highlighted.
I think John is spot on as far as distributed leadership is concerned. You could describe it as situational leadership, and what we call the new normal today may actually perhaps become, the new normal for a long time to come. We wouldn't revert to the situation pre-COVID-19. I believe that there's a change which cannot be undone. So I think I appreciate that point very much.
I can see our next questions come in from Mohammed. Mohammed asks, how does the public in developed and developing world perceive the authority of the public servant? So I think that can probably go to both of you. So John, maybe I'll come to you first on that.
Yeah, what a good question. And you can tell from the pace of my talk, my response, and my body language, I'm dissembling frantically because it's actually a very difficult question to answer. I think I can speak authoritatively, I think, for the developed world because I happen to live in the developed world. I've spent time in the developing world, but I'm probably more familiar with the developed world. The authority of the public servant, it's probably a bit of a a misnomer, actually. In the developed world, public servants are not normally deemed to have authority unless it's grudgingly allowed by the population. I won't say that public servants are viewed as a sort of unfortunate necessity, but they are not generally viewed as having the same I'll use the word kudos. I don't mean that in a either particularly complimentary or negatory sense, as the heroes of the private sector, for example. And you can tell I use that phrase in inverted commas because we still live, even now, in an era when entrepreneurs and big names in the private sector are viewed as almost gods by the public. Very rarely does anybody say, you know, actually, look at that public servant. What they have done has saved thousands and thousands of lives. Aren't they marvelous? I have yet ever to see that from any medium at all, indeed from anybody at all. So unfortunately, I think unsung heroes is how I would describe the public servants in the developed world.
Tendra, maybe I can come to you for the other half of that conversation, that question on maybe how are they viewed in the developing world?
I'll talk about that very briefly, but just let me give you the example of a developed country. Let's take France. In France, post-World War II, every single French president and prime minister, with the exception of Mitterrand and Sarkozy, have been products of the École Nationale d'Administration, or ENA for short. And therefore, France has been ruled by bureaucrats effectively, with the central government supporting them. This goes back to Napoleon's time. Now, in such a situation, do the French public love the ENARCs? Not particularly. Traveling across France and working with ENA, I found that they were not very popular. So when I spoke at the school, I said that, look, when the next French Revolution takes place, the guillotine would be on the left bank of the river where the bureaucrats are. But President Macron has gone a step further, in spite of being an ENARC, and he has guillotined ENA itself. And therefore, the bureaucrats in France have been, to a large extent, I believe, guillotined. Now, coming to India, civil servants, we belong to one of the most unloved professionals. You don't come across anyone who says, look, I love bureaucrats, because no one does. And the sooner we realize that, the better. Just a second. So now in such a position, I think that we civil servants are subject to a fair amount of scrutiny. In the senior cadres in a country like India, there is an old and lingering sense of noblesse oblige, that you're above local politics and therefore you can help. And therefore, to some extent, professional administrators are regarded as not just a necessary evil, but someone who has his uses and can be retained. The last point I'd like to make is that there's an unspoken love affair between politicians and bureaucrats in my country. They tend to blame each other, but I believe that in some respects, they're brothers under the skin. Each needs the other. And the generalist bureaucrat is both a useful whipping boy and a counterweight against professional bureaucrats and technocrats. So they have their uses. The system will continue. It may be an anachronism, but I believe it will continue for some time, as long as there is a demand and as long as local government in India doesn't develop. In Europe, things were different because local governments grew organically, as it were, from the Middle Ages. In Africa, you had tribal systems which had a strong local content. In India, we didn't really have that.
Thanks, Chandra. And I think that's an interesting couple of answers, because it's in many ways quite a skeptical answer, particularly on the kind of view of civil servants authority in only developed countries. But I also wonder, equally, this pandemic has shown that the public do trust civil servants. And I can certainly, maybe I can only speak for the UK, but whenever there is a controversial decision, introduced in the UK, the Prime Minister is always flanked by its Chief Medical Officer and the Chief Scientific Advisor. So there is an interesting dichotomy at play there, perhaps, between the kind of questions over authority that I think you both highlighted, but perhaps also one of trust as well. I think what we'll do, we'll come to the next question now, if I just find where it is. So one of the questions, I don't know the name, but it's open to both of you. What will be the future of the world in the current scenario of COVID, which is carrying on and changing the shape after a couple of months? So what will be the future of the world? So not a small question for you both. In the current scenario of COVID, which is carrying on and changing the shape after a couple of months.
Do you want me to come back on that first? Yeah, I'm going to give you a real cop-out of an answer here, because I'm going to use this rather unlovely acronym VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, an acronym that came, I think, in the late 80s from the US Army War College to describe the post-Cold War world, and which is now accurately, I think, used to describe the world in general, and the way that we can't really rely upon anything being consistent for more than half a day or so, that sort of thing. In that context, it's, and this is where the cop-out comes, it's actually impossible to predict what the world is going to look like, really, any distance ahead. However, having said that, the great value of distributed leadership is that it allows a society, a community, to collect data at a myriad different points, in fact, much more than a myriad different points, and to respond to that those situations very quickly. So that even though the world is volatile, uncertain, etc., the response of society to it can almost keep up with events. So the shape of the world in the future doesn't necessarily need to be predicted and doesn't necessarily matter as long as we can keep up with it. And in doing so, make sure that we don't let it fall apart. I'll just very quickly add one rider to that, which is I often use a cheetah as the example of an organism, an animal that uses data very rapidly, because it runs hugely quickly, but its agility is not based on its speed, it's based on its ability to change direction very, very quickly, because the antelopes that it chases change direction very, very quickly. The cheetah has accrued a capability for not just rapid response, but for prediction, because the cheetah can, at some time or other, catch the antelope. And the only reason that happens is because the cheetah predicts where the antelope is going to go next and is waiting there for it when it arrives. It can only be split second, but nevertheless, that's the way it works. And actually, anybody who drives a car will be able to understand how that happens, because we continually, as we are driving, predict what is happening in the traffic around us, which is why there are no more accidents than there already are. So as a society, if we can not only distribute the leadership, and this comes back now to the professional development, if we can train all of our public servants to be able to read the data, the signals in the marketplace, make their decisions accordingly, and actually learn to predict, not necessarily very far ahead, just far enough ahead to be there when the antelope arrives.
Just on that, I wonder for you, John, what is more important for a civil servant, to be able to effectively read what is right in front, or effectively react to what is in front of them, or to be able to predict correctly what might be lying ahead?
I think in the immediacy of our operational teams, the ability to rapidly respond is the most important thing. As we, and I won't say as we go up the ladder of management or leadership, because we want everybody, as we go up the ladder of competency, more and more it's necessary to be able to predict what is going to come next. And if I use this conversation as an example, if I had never given a presentation or a speech before, I would be frantically trying to respond to the questions that come through without knowing what to expect. Actually, as I've done this lots of times and made every imaginable mistake when it comes to presentations, presentations and speeches, I'm able to predict just a little bit two things. One, there'll be questions about this or that, and two, there'll be at least one question I don't know the answer to. So if we can train everybody to have the confidence to think, actually, I know what I'm doing, and therefore I should be able to predict a little bit what's going to happen, I think that's, in a sense, is the way to square that circle, which is more important.
Batendra, I'll come to you now for any thoughts you have on that question.
As far as civil service responses are concerned, the point made by John is well taken. They will learn to be a little more on the ball, as it were, respond to new situations faster, and think laterally about a number of issues. Regarding the scenario, maybe a year from now, we may well be back in a situation where we're coming back to the old normal. If we have anything to go by, soon after the Spanish flu abated, we found people going back to the old ways once again. So therefore, there is an element of uncertainty. And I believe that some lessons would be learned, some would be forgotten.
Thanks, Batendra. I'll come to, I can see we've got a question from Eric. And Eric's question is directed at John, but once again, Batendra, I can come to you for your thoughts on this. Eric asks, if followers or professionals in parentheses become leaders in a pandemic like the current one, who then is accountable for things that may go wrong in the process of implementation of swift decisions?
Yeah, this is where distributed leadership suddenly becomes very scary for everybody concerned, because it's all very well, the cloak of authority comes with the lead boots of accountability. And very often those people who are not familiar with authority don't realize this at all. And I have to say, I'm back to this professional development rationale actually here. It is vitally important, because whoever makes decisions needs to be accountable for the results of those decisions. And the more that we distribute or devolve authority, the more we also have to, of course, devolve accountability. We also have to provide the training, the development, the competencies which enable people to confidently make decisions at a distributed level. Having said that, there's one caveat, I think, which is particularly in public service. Policy actually is the determining factor for all decision making. And in a way, the accountability that accrues to policy makers cannot be devolved or delegated. And we've all seen in the past people being sacked or castigated publicly because they made a decision which actually was the result of a policy decision by somebody much more senior. I do think that practical responsibility and accountability for decisions can accrue to those people who make the decisions. The policymakers cannot abdicate that responsibility. So it's, in a sense, it's a shared responsibility, I think.
Mm-hmm. I guess the traditional view is policymakers, politicians, political leaders make the decisions, civil servants carry those decisions out. I wonder, though, have the last 16 months blurred that line, that division? And does that create complications?
Absolutely. And in fact, I think the sort of paradoxically what has happened is that we've seen increasing willingness and in fact increasing insistence by politicians on making decisions, and increasing dancing around by officials, civil servants, public servants, in trying to implement those decisions without actually negatively affecting the constituencies that they represent or for which they are responsible. Because with the best will in the world, I have to say, not all of the decisions that have been made by our politicians appear to have been the right ones, even with foresight, let alone with hindsight. So I think, there's been much more willingness for politicians to say, right, we're in charge now, we're going to do this, rather than making just policy. And a courageous and heroic response, often from public servants, in trying to implement that as little negatively as possible.
Thanks, John. Batendra, maybe I'll just come to you quickly on that topic of accountability.
Well, the buck stops with the politicians. And as they're in charge overall. Now, the question comes about holding the scientific community, holding them to account. Now, Dr. Fauci is a figure which comes to mind. And President Trump and President Biden have made sure that he stays in the limelight, so he can become the fall guy as well. Now, the scientific community themselves, and this is being increasingly recognized, that they are not too sure about what's happening. And they're sharing information to the best of our ability. Heads wouldn't roll, but I believe that the scientific community are struggling to stay abreast with the development. This is entirely understandable, but the buck does certainly start and end with the politicians. They are responsible.
Thanks, Bhatendra. I'll come to Keith's question next, which Keith asked, with so many competing priorities, how do you decide what is the most pressing need and not just a reactionary one? So maybe, Bhatendra, I'll come to you first this time on that.
Well, because governments don't always act, they react. And therefore, what's immediate tends to crowd out the important. And this does happen. We have very few statesmen left in the world today. And statesman-like behavior is quite often conspicuous by its absence. So what happens is that we do get knee-jerk reactions from political leaders, and the civil servants tend to carry this out, often without questioning and without putting up a fight.
John, maybe I'll come to you next on that.
Yeah, sure. And this is where I tend to become a bit of a maverick here, I think, really, because this idea of a person deciding which is the most pressing priority, which normally rests at the policy level, is old-fashioned in a sense. And this is where I believe completely in distributed leadership. The more distributed the ability to make a decision is about a particular event, the more useful it is and the more effectively the response can be delivered. Now, immediately, of course, having said that, we are talking here about a pandemic which has huge policy implications in not just in political terms, but in economic, in social, in technological terms, in everything else. And it would be wrong to say, well, actually, everybody can decide whether, who gets what health coverage in their particular village or whatever it is. So there does need to be some policy decision at the higher level. I have always had 6 responsibilities in mind for a national government. The first one is national security. The second one is the rule of law. The third one is provision of infrastructure. Those 3 are the starting point for a national government. And then health, shelter, education. And I always think of them in that order. So I suppose that would be my answer, really. Whatever the decision is, where does it sit on this priority list of big ticket items? And what therefore should be the optimum decision at the level at which the decision is taken. But it's a hard one. It's a hard one.
Just on that topic of distributed leadership, do you think, obviously it's certainly been heightened by the pandemic, do you think this is here to stay, or do you think we might return to what it was perhaps like a bit more of a centralized leadership?
I think I'm with Bhatendra on this, which is that some will, some will not, I guess, really. The impetus from the operational level will be a bit of a mix. Many people will actually have enjoyed the fact that they could make a decision and get things right, and some will have been scared witless by it. And I think the more that we can provide professional development for those people at the front line, and not just the front line, but actually in the managerial, right up to middle management, senior management level, the more confidence we will give people to make those decisions, and the more allowance we can be comfortable with in terms of distributed leadership. Those who are currently powerful and for whom they feel that defines them will be less comfortable with the idea of distributed leadership. And it's an interesting question whether those people, say certainly in politics, if the people in politics are the sort of people, having got to where they got, who would be willing to let go of some of those reins of power. And I have a question mark over that, I think.
Thanks, John. The next question comes in from Victoria, and it's directed at Batendra. And I think it's a follow-up to a comment that you made earlier. So Victoria asks, so as a follow-up, how about when a trainer also has an added advantage of being a practitioner as well? And maybe I'll just broaden out that question to both our keynote speakers. How important is it that our trainers have kind of...
Sure. No, it does happen, because trainers, the people who are most acceptable to the audience, are practitioners. So we have a system where professional civil servants work as trainers for a while, then they go back to the field to recharge their batteries, as it were. So when they come back, they retain a degree of credibility. The longer you spend in a training institution, the less credibility you have. And therefore, maybe tenures of about 3 years. So generally, the policy has been to send your trainers, depute them to training institutions, and after they spend about 3 years, send them back to the field. And this does happen. And the audience, the civil servants, both newcomers and serving civil servants, are particularly unkind to academics, unfairly so, but this happens.
John?
Yeah, I like Batendra. I am a practitioner. I've owned my own business more than once. I've been a chief exec on a number of occasions, and I have to say I wouldn't dare talk to anybody about leadership unless I had suffered the slings and arrows of having been in a leadership position myself, I think. I also agree very much with Batendra, this idea that the further one is from practice, the less credibility one has as a trainer. And I really like the idea of 3 years or so as a trainer and then going back into the field to, in a sense, even just to update the practice, really, because things move very, very quickly. I don't think there's any field in which I would not say being a practitioner is a prerequisite to being an effective trainer. I think that I would go that far.
Okay. Brilliant. Well, thanks, John. I think our next question comes from Arthur from Sierra Leone, and is perhaps a challenge to at least the title of your presentation, John. Arthur asks, in developing economies, leaders, in parentheses again, politicians, do not tend to consult with their followers and do not seem to be aware or take cognizance of public demand. So I'm finding it very difficult to understand how leaders have become followers. So that's from Arthur from Sierra Leone. So over to you, John.
Yeah, and I have to say I have huge sympathy for your view, Arthur, actually, because I spoke, sadly, as I tend to do, in generalizations. And of course, with every generalization, there are outliers either side of it. It will have depended upon the country concerned, the degree of pressure under which those politicians and other government leaders felt, and the quality, the perceived quality of the advice, for example, from the medical or indeed scientific practitioners. It's also the case, so that's the first determinant of whether or not they would be prepared to follow their advice. The second one is what I mentioned earlier on about having followed the advice, oh, we need to do something, then reverting immediately to the leadership role and actually, a bit like a pendulum, overcompensating by becoming even more authoritarian on the basis that very often I think politicians equate authoritarian with being decisive, which isn't quite the same. So in some nations, absolutely, the politicians would not have become followers. The leaders would not have become followers because for any number of reasons, they would not have seen a need to do so, not least their grip upon their own positions. In some countries, they were willing to do so because, and if I use the UK as an example, not following scientific and medical advice in a pandemic, and that being made very public, which it all was in the UK, is a recipe for losing the next election. So the grip upon somebody's leadership position has a huge impact on whether or not they are ever willing to become a follower, even in the face of an emergency. And I actually thank you, Arthur, for raising this, because that's a really important point for us to have to recognise.
Batendra, if I just put that question.
I agree with Arthur. In many developing countries, the political leadership are very often unwilling to revisit their position or become followers.
I just wonder, is the dichotomy and the implicit assumption of Arthur's question is that the distinction is between developed and developing economies. And Batendra, you raised during your presentation kind of three prevailing trends which are dominating global politics at the moment: end of ideology, rent seeking, and populism. And I just wonder how much is that confined between developed on one hand and developing on the other, and rather just those kind of three trends which are going through a number of different states to different degrees at different times. So should it be simply developed on one hand, developing on the other, or is it a bit more blurred on that?
I think President Trump has helped bridge the divide between developed and developing countries when it comes to populism, when it comes to being a wannabe authoritarian. So what happens is that a figure like Trump is someone we can relate to, maybe slightly comical, but still. He does display he did display a trend of authoritarianism. And as I mentioned to you, when he heard that President Xi had become president for life, he thought wistfully about whether he could do the same.
Thanks, Batendra. I think our next question comes in from Jasmine, who asks, to what extent would I, as a public servant, take up situational leadership, in quotes, roles without being insubordinating to my immediate supervisor or authority, particularly during a state of public emergency? So John, maybe I'll come to you first on that. How would Jasmine, as a public servant, take up situational leadership without insubordinating to her immediate supervisor?
Yeah, good question. And the phrase that springs to mind here is self-defense, because I think there's no doubt whatever decisions we make on the basis of what's going to happen to me when I make this decision if I carry it out. And I think this comes maybe back to this idea of preemptive or preventive agility, the idea of predicting in advance. If we have agreed beforehand with our supervisor that in the event of an emergency, this is what we will do or what we will allow, then that challenge, what happens if I do this, doesn't arise. That hadn't happened, of course, hasn't happened in the pandemic because nobody was expecting it. We didn't have all the protocols in place to respond to it. So in Jasmine's case, Jasmine would need to, in a way, predict or at least be aware of the likely response of the supervisor to any given decision. And one of the ways to mitigate danger in that situation is actually to contact the supervisor, if it's possible, of course, if it's possible, and share the idea. And it's very difficult outside of any given situation really to be able to say much more than that, except that this idea of let's have some protocols in place just in case something happens is actually not beyond the bounds of possibility. If you think about emergency services, police, fire, ambulance, Coast Guard, all of these services, they have already very clear, rigid protocols for what happens if there's an emergency. And if you ever read, there are lots of novels which describe this sort of stuff. But the fact is, if there is an emergency somewhere, there is a set of actions taken by each of the services which respond to that emergency. They're all taken in a particular order or parallel, and they all know what those actions are. So it might not be that we'll ever see another pandemic. We probably will, but it might not be in our lifetime. However, we will see other emergencies. So let's have that conversation. And maybe this is a professional development module that actually might be thought about. What do we do in the context of an emergency if we work in the public service? Who are our stakeholders? Who do we need to liaise with? Who needs to do stuff before we can do stuff? Things like that. So it doesn't help Jasmine in the current climate. However, going forward, it will help all public servants if we can have that, how do we predict what might happen, mindset.
For you, does distributed leadership emerge top down, or is it a bottom up thing?
That's even more self-defense related. I think that if I was it in a sense, it's like many things, it's driven by context, because we are, all of us, either blessed or cursed, whichever way we look at it, with an organizational hierarchy. Every one of us has an organization chart and we know where we sit on it. Until something happens which makes that organizational chart redundant, then we generally tend to be quite content. We might want to move around in that organization chart. We know what to do in order to do that. So it is driven from outside rather than from bottom up or top down. And it is the context, like a sudden emergency, for example, which demands and therefore leaves no choice about, I have to make this decision. Yeah. So, and I think in the absence, just a quick answer to the question, in the absence of an emergency, it should be top down, because it should be prompted by the senior leadership to let go and at the same time develop people who are confident enough, because the outcome we want is distributed leadership, not more leadership at the top.
Thanks, John. Maybe Batendra, if I come to you, if you have any thoughts on that?
Yasmin, I think your role would be that of a salesperson, because as a civil servant, you're selling an idea, and as you move up the hierarchy, you bring knowledge and a rational solution to the problem. And therefore, a sensible supervisor, whether bureaucratic or political, would probably go along with you on that. And as far as standard operating procedures are concerned, I'm sure that there will be more in place now, post-pandemic. But there is a lot of scope for initiatives at any level, provided you have a good idea and you can sell it. Because not only civil servants, but even trainers in administrative institutions, even teachers, are also salespersons. You're selling an idea to an audience and they can buy it or they can reject it. So therefore, the traditional belief in many countries and in my country is that the teacher is regarded as a wise person. Not anymore. If they were wise and great people, they probably left this planet very long ago. So basically, people are struggling for answers, and therefore you do put forward an idea which can be acceptable and which is rational.
Can I just add to that, if I may, just very quickly, Jack, please, but say for Jasmine, the salesperson idea is really, really good. What you're trying to sell to your supervisor or manager is, this will make you look good. Sure. That's the message you want to get across to them.
No, the boss is very clear in his mind that, look, guys, I take the credit, and if there's blame to be had, it should be passed down the line.
Thanks, guys. I think we've got a couple more minutes, so we've got just time for a couple more questions. So if anyone does have any more burning questions, please pop them into the chat box, and we'll quickly come to them. I think the next question I'm going to take is from Eric, and I think it's quite an interesting one. Eric asks, I've realized that the so-called developing countries are not in a position to make their homegrown decision-making during the current pandemic, but rather rely solely on what America and Britain does. What is your take on this issue, John and Batendra? So I think there are a few assumptions in that developing countries are taking their decision making from say developed countries. And yeah, what are your thoughts on that? So maybe John, I'll come to you first.
Yes, sure. I think there are clearly a few assumptions in there, I think, Eric. Not all of them that I would agree with. I think, first of all, much as I'm British, I'm sitting in the UK at the moment. Despite my enormous ego, I'm not entirely sure that I would describe the UK as being the leaders of the world as far as pandemic behaviour is concerned. We're doing things that nobody else is doing, but that doesn't necessarily make us an exemplar or anything like that. And I think also the idea of relying solely on what America and Britain do gives the economic might, certainly the economic might of America, rather more credit for all of the other things that go on in the world and around the pandemic. So I think my take is actually what America and Britain do might get talked about more than an awful lot of other countries. Not all of them, but a lot of others. It's not necessarily the determinant of what any other country actually does.
Thanks, John. I'd probably agree with that. I think in the UK, we've been spending a lot of time looking abroad and comparing ourselves to other countries. If not Sweden, it's Australia and New Zealand, and if not them, it's Taiwan and South Korea as well. So I don't know if I can necessarily agree with Britain acting as some kind of leader on COVID-19. But Tendra, maybe I'll come to you on that one.
Well, all countries have made mistakes, and serious ones at that. No one has come out, smelling like roses, as it were, because they were all taken aback. India is in a peculiar situation because we have the world's single largest producer of vaccines. And we had committed to supply them to Gavi for global assistance. We told the WHO, we'll give you so many million vials of vaccine. When the second wave hit us, we stopped exporting vaccines. And this affected a lot of other countries. We need to apologize to all of them for not honoring our commitments to the WHO. But we were affected by a pandemic which our leadership did not foresee. Our leadership did make mistakes, serious ones. They're now getting their act together. As far as looking at the developed countries are concerned, they really haven't been role models at all. They've made mistakes in their own way, and so have we. So I think all of us now are learning from our mistakes. And if a third wave does strike, as it probably will, I think we're better prepared than before.
Thanks, Tendra, and thanks, John. I think I've just got one more question, which I think is a fairly short question. I think it comes in from Hegin, who asked, could you both please share some resources for reading on situational leadership and how it evolves? So any of you have any book recommendations or articles or websites for people to go to? John, maybe I'll come to you first on that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think Ken Blanchard, I think, is the name that comes to mind when I think about situational leadership. So if you Google Ken Blanchard and situational leadership, you'll find all sorts of things there. There's also there's a website called situational.com, which has an awful lot of really powerful and useful information there. So I would use that as the starting point, definitely.
Thanks, John. Sandra?
Yes, this issue has been examined by social psychologists over a number of years, that the situation invariably brings out its own leader. A person where there is a lot of uncertainty, the person who thinks he or she knows where he's going becomes a leader almost by accident, because as they say, among the blind, the one-eyed man is king. So therefore, situations do throw up leaders who may not remain leaders for very long, but till the time that crisis is there, the leadership is taken. And I think that Dr. Fauci is a case in mind. No matter how he's been reviled, the fact is that he seemed to know more than most of the others, and therefore he was listened to.
Thank you very much, Sandra, and thank you very much, John, for both of your excellent presentations this morning, and also for so excellently answering all of the questions that have come into us today. I know we've got a hand up, and I think there are some questions that perhaps have gone unanswered, but we will be sharing these this chat box. So any other questions, maybe pop into the chat box, and we can come to them post-event. But thank you everyone for really getting involved in that Q&A session. We've had some brilliant questions, and really from a wide range of countries. I've seen questions come in from East Asia, from the DRC, from Palestine. So we really had a really good array of questions there. I think what we'll now do, and as we've just crept over 11:40, we'll now head across to our final presentation, which will be provided by Tracy again, and also I think Jerome will be supporting this. So Tracy, if you're ready, perhaps I'll hand back over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jack. Thank you very much indeed, everybody, for your questions and the fabulous answers from John and Bartendra. Hopefully you can see my screen.
All good.
Excellent. Okay. So I shall, oops, he says. Right. I shall move to the final presentation of the three. We talked originally about the ICPS training provision for individual learners, then moved on and talked about how we can provide training solutions for organizations who are looking for a customized solution for a group of learners. And now we are going to talk a little bit about supporting learners in the workplace, which I think is a good segue in relation to the conversation that's gone around distributed leadership anyway. Before I start, I'd like to thank in advance Jerome, who will be joining me during this short presentation. And so let's get going. Okay, so we can support learners in the workplace in three ways with our e-learning provision. Okay, and ostensibly there are three offers that we have. We have a portfolio of content developed by our partners, the Institute of Leadership and Management, and Jerome will very kindly walk us through that in a moment. And secondly, we have a further library of content which we'll be bringing to the market later this year. And then finally, we have the ability to develop e-learning solutions specifically for organizations. So without further ado, I shall pass over to Jerome, and Jerome will also prompt me to move from screen to screen when he needs that to be the case. Thank you, Jerome.
Thank you, Tracy, and thank you all. It's my great honour to join you today for what has been a fascinating and stimulating discussion and event. It's my pleasure to introduce the Institute of Leadership and Management, which is the organisation that John so brilliantly leads. I'm a business manager within the Institute with 20 years experience in the industry, both as a practitioner and a business manager. The Institute of Leadership Management is proud to work in partnership with ICPS and Government Exchange, and we're a professional body, very enthusiastic about delivering our mission, which is to inspire great leadership everywhere. And we've been doing so for almost 75 years. You can see a date stamp on the slide, which is 1947. We support a global community of members. So we facilitate, inspire, engage, and coordinate and support a global community of leaders, managers, coaches, mentors, circa 50,000 individuals that are part of our community across 60 countries. And we work with organizations as well. Next slide, please, Tracy. And I've only got 3. Brilliant, excellent. As Tracy mentioned earlier, we support and work with ICPS on e-learning provision. And this occurs through our multi-award-winning e-learning platform called My Leadership. And My Leadership was born from an extensive research project at the Institute of Leadership and Management, whereby we challenged ourselves to define what great leadership looks like. And a framework was born called the Dimensions of Leadership. And this informs and populates the e-learning platform, which you can see on screen. Essentially, you'll see the circles, 5 core dimensions with authenticity at the heart. And under that, you'll see a whole series of sub-modules. And apologies, the writing is quite minuscule, but what instantly we accept is that great leadership is multidimensional, multifaceted, and is constantly evolving and changing. And sitting behind every single module is content, self-directed learning across a range of areas to engage different learning preferences and styles. Reading, doing, audio, visual. There were quizzes and incremental recognition and reward through digital credentials and digital badges. So really engaging e-learning content that is provided through ICPS in partnership with the Institute of Leadership and Management. And you can see the bullets, a whole range of assets and articles and content that you have access to via the platform. Final slide, please, Tracy. The platform itself is agile in that, as Tracy has mentioned, you can access it and the courses within it in a number of ways. For in-house provision, as Tracy mentioned, we can build pathways, as we call them, or a microsite within the platform. And what you can see on screen is a much more focused view of the topics, whereas before we had the full platform. Here we're pinpointing certain topics, and you can do exactly that for your organizations. Pick out the topics that resonate, those priority important topics that you want to focus on, the areas that you want to develop your people's knowledge, skills and behaviors in. So really flexible in terms of how you do that. So work with Tracy and his team, and we're on hand as well to build these for you. And the experience for the participants is a welcome, a login, which takes them to their tailored pathway, which has is branded with your logo, so that nice co-branding. And please call your development pathway, you know, give it a name that that resonates with you. So we'll be delighted to work with you to develop your own internal pathways. And that concludes my short contribution to this brilliant seminar. So back to you, Tracy, and thank you again all.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jerome. Thank you for that. Okay, so following on from that is that says a solution that is available today. But just to give you a highlight in relation to further materials which will be available for helping support people in the workplace with their learning. Further e-learning materials we will be providing a latter point in the year, covering these particular areas. And then finally is that we have the facility with our team of instructional designers and programmers to develop purely bespoke solutions for our customers. And even though we'll be able to produce on many different sorts of applications, typically for distributed learning, it's these types of areas that we get involved in. So induction training, processes and procedures, and product knowledge. But as I say, is that ostensibly is please do talk to us, and we'd be very happy to discuss on what we may be able to provide for you. Okay. So moving on is that just to the final piece in relation to supporting people in the workplace, is often we talk about whether it's distributed or not, is leadership can be a lonely place. And therefore, you know, we are very much wed to being able to provide online coaching, but in areas of expertise that we have. So ostensibly, it's not generalized online coaching, it's online coaching around strategy, policy, regulatory reform, people in leadership with our partners here, trade and investment and change management. And again, is that, you know, with those imminent, tough quick decisions in a distributed model that people are having to make is supporting individuals in the workplace, right through from frontline into medium to senior level management is key. And I say we're committed to doing that. So that concludes the presentations. And what I'd just like to say is that you know, whether you're looking for courses for individuals, for groups that need customization, or supporting learners in the workplace, you know, we are driven to provide training excellence for public servants. And I thank you for your time on that. So I'll pass you back now to Jack. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tracy and Jerome, for that excellent presentation. If anybody does have any questions for either Tracy or Jerome, or to be honest, any of our other keynote speakers, please, we've got a few more minutes, so we can quickly come to them now. I can see Piers put a question in, which I guess is for Jerome and John, which asks, is the platform available if you are an ILM member?
I'll take this question. And thank you, Piers. Quicker to respond verbally. I started to write in chat, but my fingers are not quick enough. So great question. Yes, as I presented earlier, we support a global community of members. So there are individuals that join the Institute of Leadership and Management, and they do have access to the generic platform as part of a portfolio of benefits and resources that we provide, including a magazine. You can see a couple of copies behind me. So there's a bundle of stuff that you get in your professional membership, including access to the platform. Now, you can come direct to the Institute or through ICPS, for example. ICPS delivers accredited training courses, and that is a pathway into membership. So we work very much aligned in that regard. And my third slide, the tailored pathway needs to occur through an approved centre. So you'd work with ICPS to build that tailored pathway that we saw. So I hope that's helpful and answers your question, Piers. Thank you.
Thanks, Jerome. I can see we also we've got a question in from Maureen, who asks, can learners with disabilities be able to access your e-learning? I guess just widening out that question, what provisions do you as the ILM and ICPS make for those with disabilities?
That's an excellent question. Thank you, Maureen. I think the inquirer there. We can do a lot more actually to support you, and please chip in, John, if you can. So I offered that there's a blend of learning. So there's audio, visual, reading elements. Now, the reading can be produced in large font to enable that. We do have limitations, i.e. hearing impairment. We don't currently have audio loops, for example. There's a lot more that we can do. As an institution, we're proud of the fact that we're an inclusive organisation, open to all. So we would certainly like to learn from you, but please do have a look at our resources, and we'd welcome your feedback in terms of what we can do better. Thank you.
And I would endorse that actually, Jerome, because we are, since I've been with the Institute, which is since September of last year, almost a year now, I've realized we are continually trying to update the material that we've got, all of the content that we've got, so it's accessible to everybody. We've got, I think, probably like ICPS, so much content that getting around to all of it takes time. However, as Jerome said, we would heartily welcome input from you as an audience, and both on your own behalf and on behalf of other people, to ensure actually that we do drive our accessibility efforts in the right direction, so that we're not actually failing any of our audience. Thanks very much for that question.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you very much, Jerome, for those answers. And I think With that, we'll probably have to, just in the interest of time, we'll have to wrap up the session there. First of all, my thanks go to all of our fantastic speakers for their excellent presentations today. I've already seen a number of the comments coming in from the audience saying what a fantastic, rich and stimulating session and thought-provoking session this has been. So thank you everyone, Tendra, John, Jerome, Tracy, for making this a really engaging session. My thanks, of course, also go out to the audience. I know we've got about 150 people at the moment attending. I think we've had about 200 people throughout the course of this session. So massive thank you to everyone for attending and getting involved in this question. We've had some really great questions coming into the speakers, making this a really interesting and interactive session. We've also had questions from all around the globe, which makes this a really worthwhile discussion today. Just a quick note, we have recorded this sessions, so we will be sharing a recording of this session. Also, with the speaker's kind permission, we will be sharing with you all the PowerPoint presentations for you all to take home with you. Also, this chat box, we've had some great questions, comments and thoughts. We will be sharing that chat box as well. Maybe while we've just got a minute or two left of this session, if you do have any questions that you would like answering, if you want to quickly pop them into the chat box, maybe with your email address, we'll try our best to get answers to them. Also, if you just want your contact information shared with the group today, please feel free to drop that all into the chat box now. Just a quick note, as I mentioned at the beginning of the session, ICPS are setting up a professional development network, which is really going to aim to carry on this conversation that we've started today. So please look out in the next couple of days for that email from us, which will be inviting you to join that network, so we can carry on that discussion with you all. With that though, thank you very much everyone for attending. Hope you have a wonderful day and look forward to hopefully seeing you on some future events and training.
Thank you very much indeed. Well done, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Bye everyone.